Number 1. The Basement. My friend Ted was such a really weird kid. I mean, I was too when I was really young. That's how the two of us became friends. We were both sort of nerdy, bookish types, and all the other kids thought we were weird. But as strange as I was thought to be, Ted was a lot stranger than even I was. He had this fascination with some really weird stuff that even sort of freaked me out. I mean, he liked a lot of death-related stuff, abandoned buildings and all sorts of other things. We grew up in the same small town all of our lives, so we were together since we were really young. Therefore, we did almost everything together. We saw each other every day. And so, even though he was weird, I don't think I trusted anyone else nearly as much as I trusted him. So the day we were both 14, when he came over and asked me if I wanted to go check out an abandoned building, I was only slightly hesitant. I knew it was going to happen because we always did what the other wanted to do. But I did want to know beforehand what building he wanted to go to, and why he wanted to do it. It was an old school building. It had closed down as a school long before I was born. For many years after that, they held voting booths there. But it had been shut down and boarded up for many years before Ted suggested this adventure of ours. It was a very old building on the outside of town, while the newer school buildings were built in town. I had never been inside the old building before. It had been closed and boarded up long before I had a chance to go in it. And mostly I was just nervous about doing so. Hell, I didn't like walking through someone's yard, much less entering a building that was shut off to the public. But he was excited about going into it. Ted was interested in exploring, and got into that whole abandoned building exploration thing. And it was really the only place around that fit the description. We got in through a broken door in the back of the building. The brush and everything back there was very overgrown, and there was a bit of litter around as well. I had to be careful to not get anything prickly caught on me as I tried to make my way through it all. It was really messy and icky. The inside of the school was no better. There was tons of trash and old equipment throughout the entire place. I almost didn't understand why people would like to scope out these places, because they're always so dirty and bad. Although, I do have to admit that they can be creepy and somewhat spooky. Ted, on the other hand, was having the time of his life. He was talking about how cool everything was. He was thinking about the kind of students who used to walk down the hallways all the time. And now, it was just an empty, deserted, and dead place. He was very fascinated by that as well. Ted wanted to go into the basement of the building, which I did not really want to do. But, as you might have figured out by now, this was his adventure, not mine. So I decided to follow him down there. It was much darker, but he had brought along a flashlight to make up for that. And that didn't keep it from being weird and creepy, though. Just being in there, thinking about all the people who would walk these halls over and over again, normally. And here we were. When we were in the basement, we heard this loud thumping noise. If it had been going on before, we hadn't heard it from upstairs. But it was so loud that we definitely should have. It was coming from what seemed to be the far room on the left side of the hallway. Ted, being like he was, automatically wanted to find out what it was. I was already nervous and unhappy about the entire situation. I tried to convince him that we should just leave, but then we heard the thumping noise again. By this time, he was way too curious to leave without taking a peek. As we went down the hallway, we heard the noise a few more times. I got more and more nervous the closer we got to that room. Whatever was going on, I really didn't want to know. If I didn't know that Ted would relentlessly mock me about it later, I would have taken off without him. However, the best I could do was keep my distance behind him. He was the overzealous one, so he should be taking the risk over me. When we got to the door, he looked into the door. I had never seen a look on his face that was anything like the look I saw that day. He turned whiter than I'd ever seen him, and a look of terror covered his face. He stood there for a moment, seemingly unable to look away from whatever he had seen inside the door. I still didn't want to look, and I made no motion to go anywhere closer to the door than I already was, and it only took that moment for Ted to decide that he had seen enough. Ted turned to me, whispered, "Let's get out of this place," and began running down the hallway. Ironically, he was trying to be quiet when he was talking, but his footfalls were making tons of noise down the hallway. I followed him. When we got to the door to the staircase, I heard something. I turned around and looked back in the direction of the thumping noise. I saw someone had opened the door and was stepping out of the room. But that is all I saw. I wanted to get out of there before whatever scared my braver friend saw me. So we got back on the first floor, got out of that building, and left as quickly as we could. The only part that sucks about this is that Ted refused to tell me what he had seen. Now, I may have assumed he did this because he was trying to scare me. You know, maybe there was nothing in the room to begin with. But I know I saw the door open, and I know, even though I didn't get a good look at them, that I saw someone walking out of that door. So there was something, and it was something to scare a friend of mine who is normally pretty brave, and it made a large thumping noise in the bottom of an abandoned school building. And that is all I know about it, or probably ever will. Number 2. The mall. I recall seeing the total transformation of a mall when I was younger. When I was a kid and even into my mid-teens, the major mall, which has since been torn down, was a pretty active mall. It had the only movie theater in the area and was an extremely popular hangout for teenagers. However, when I was 15, an outlet mall opened up that wasn't very far from the mall, and this brought a rather quick decline to the major mall. For a while the mall hung on because it still had the only theater in the area, but a few Regal cinemas then began opening up in the area. At that point, the only thing left in the mall was a Ticketmaster. However, it didn't take very long before that went under as well. Eventually, this mall became nothing more than a shadow of what it had been before. I honestly don't know a lot about what it went through from its closing into its eventual demolition. I knew that one of the reasons that it was eventually going to be demolished was the worry that it would become a haven for gang activity. However, I don't really know if this happened or not. All I can tell you is what did happen during this time period is what happened when I decided to check it out. It was a pretty stupid thing to do. Even though I had a job, I spent a little bit of time being homeless. I was sleeping in my car to save up money to eventually get a place to live. It wasn't actually as bad as some people might think it was, however. I had blankets and pillows, so I was very comfortable. The only thing that bothered me was having something to do, and I really had to often search for something. And this brings us to the mall. I heard from someone at work that they were still trying to figure out what they wanted to do with the massive building, and I got to thinking that it might be someone interesting to go and check it out on my day off from work. Well, technically, my night off from work. There were some pretty busy roads in that area, and if I didn't want to get caught snooping around, I had to go at night. So I made sure that it was pretty late outside when I finally went to check the place out. I parked in a motel parking lot that was close by, Then I walked over to the mall. Walking around such a large and empty place was pretty weird at first. I had never been in the parking lot before when it was completely empty. At first I just walked around the building. I had no intention of breaking into it or anything like that. However, at one point, I did notice that one of the doors looked like it had a broken latch on it. So I decided to see if I could get it open. It was much easier than I had thought, and then I was not sure what I wanted to do next. But after a while I decided to go into the mall and check it out. Now, this was a surreal experience. It was such a big and bustling area back in the day, and now it was empty. It was empty of people and of fixtures. Most of the stores had these big metal grating doors pulled down. When I shined my flashlight into them, they still had fixtures and things like that. However, there, of course, wasn't any merchandise or people in the place. I decided to try and go up one of the escalators. Of course it was turned off, but I used it as a normal staircase. It was still pretty solid though, even though I expected it to be rather shaky. There wasn't a whole lot different on the top floor than the second floor, although they did have an old Auntie Anne's, which gave me a craving for a pretzel. I walked by a bookstore and was looking at the bookshelves in it. I was moving the flashlight around the store, and when I moved it toward the back of the store, the light fell upon a man standing in the back and looking at me. I jumped from being startled, but didn't move the light. He was not a security guard or anything like that. He was dressed in plain clothes, but he did have a gun in his hand, which he was holding down at his side. It only took the slightest movement of his arm coming up for me to realize that I needed to get the hell out of there. And I did. I ran back the way I came and down that escalator. When I got to the bottom of it, I looked up and saw him standing at the top of it, joined by someone else. He hadn't fired the gun at me or anything, thank God, so I hoped he was just trying to scare me away from the area. I don't believe that he followed me down the stairs at first. I hurried toward the door I had gained entry from and got out. I kept expecting something to happen behind me, so I kept checking, but nothing happened, and I got out. While I hurried across the parking lot, I kept looking back over my shoulder to see if anyone was following me. Keep in mind this was a big parking lot, so I got a lot of glances back towards it. And at one point, the two men had come out of the store, but they didn't follow me across the parking lot. I got to my car and got out of that place. There was an apartment building that I had been using the parking lot in, and I didn't feel safe until I got back there. I knew there was no way that the men could have followed me there, but I still felt edgy about the whole thing. I learned my lesson that day about going into places where I don't belong. If the man had been anyone different, he might have shot me. Perhaps I had stumbled upon something illegal going on, and if I did, I think the way he and his friend chased me out was probably their way of just trying to scare me into never coming back. It worked very well. Number 3. Discovery. I've done a lot of hiking and exploring in my time. One of my favorite things to do when I'm out in the woods is to find something left over from back in the days. What I mean is that I come across old farm-type equipment, an old well, an old barn, and sometimes you come across other really old buildings. I often wondered about the buildings more than anything else. You could find houses and sheds and things like that in the strangest of places. When I was still living at home, I decided to go on a hike once. That is when I probably had the scariest experience of my entire life. I think I was 16 years old at the time. My family lived in an area that had a lot of woods around it to explore. I spent more time than I can even recall walking around the area, exploring and finding things. So by the time I was 16, I thought that I probably couldn't be surprised by anything. However, on this day, I was absolutely surprised by what I found. At first, I couldn't tell what it was by looking at it, but I noticed a lot of unusual growth at a certain point, so I thought I would make my way over to it. It looked like there was some sort of opening in the side of the hill. Curious, I began beating back some of the growth to get a better look. At first I thought I had found a cave. Pretty neat, but not extremely unusual for the area that I was in. But the more I checked it out, the more I realized that I had, in fact, found an abandoned mine. I had never seen anything like that before, and was immediately intrigued. Honestly, no thoughts went through my head about the possible dangers of exploring an abandoned mine. I just immediately knew that I wanted to check it out, but I had to spend some time clearing out the brush out of the way so I could do this. The only light I had on me was from my wristwatch, and that wasn't going to do a whole lot of good. So I needed outside light to see. I cautiously stepped into the mine after I cleared the growth. I wish I could explain to you how it smelled, because it was an interesting odor that I had never encountered before. But as you might expect, the mine was very dark and very dank. The light from the entrance was enough to allow me to see where I was going, but not by very much. Although it was intriguing, there wasn't much to it at first. There wasn't any old equipment or anything like that. If it hadn't been for the support beams that had been built into it, I probably would have thought that I was in a normal cave. Finally, something did catch my eye, however. There was something up ahead of me lying on the ground. It was covered in dirt or clay or whatever was on the foot of the mine, but it was a clear indentation, so I moved in for a better look. When I got close enough, there wasn't really a good enough light coming from the entrance to make out what I was seeing. I knew I'd have to rely on the small light from my wristwatch to make it out. When I shined the light on it, I immediately recoiled. Although I had been to funerals before, and I had seen dead bodies in caskets before too, I had never seen a human skeleton that wasn't in a classroom or a doctor's office. This was absolutely the first time. I looked over the skeleton with the light. It had obviously been there a really long time. The skeletal remains were all that was left of the body. Everything else had decomposed a long time ago, or, I shuddered, been eaten by scavengers. What was the scariest part, though, is that when I got up to the head, I noticed a sizable hole in it. I immediately thought that this person was probably murdered by being shot in the head and then left in the mine. When I have told this story before, people have asked me why I didn't check inside the skull to see if there was a bullet. My answer is always, how do you feel about picking up the skull of an old and decayed body and checking inside it for bullets? I knew that I wasn't in any danger, but that didn't stop me from being scared. At that point, I just wanted to get out of that mine as quickly as I could. But I also didn't want to fall and injure myself, so I had to be as careful as possible making it out. The last thing that mine needed was another dead body inside of it. But it was a bit of an eerie hell walking through that mine to get out of it. I had this irrational fear that someone or something was inside the mine, and that whatever killed this poor guy was going to get me next. I decided to go home immediately. I told my dad about what I'd seen and wondered about what we should do. In the end, he decided that we shouldn't do anything, which I at first found rather shocking. My dad explained to me that firstly, I was trespassing on someone else's property. Well, I couldn't argue against that, I was. Furthermore, he told me, and this I didn't really agree with, was that the body had obviously been there for a really long time. There was no need to call attention to it and ruffle the feathers of whoever owned that property. I couldn't get the thought out of my head, though. It bothered me deeply, thinking that someone may have been missing for years, and finding his body could bring a family closure. So I eventually called the police and left an anonymous message about what I had found and where I had found it. I was really worried for a while and would always try to read the newspaper after that before my father could get to it. I was afraid the body would have been found in the mine and he would be upset with me for going against his advice. The story, however, never ended up in the newspaper that I ever saw. I went out again a few months later to go and check out the mine again. I wanted to see if the skeleton had been removed. However, I couldn't seem to find the mine again. A few times after that had similar results. I never saw the mine again, and to this day, I have no idea who that skeleton in that old abandoned mine was. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you liked the stories, and please let me know if you did. You know, the whole thing, hit the like button, leave me a comment, and as always, I will try to get back to most of the comments, if not all of them. And of course, share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. You know, abandoned building or abandoned places videos are always kind of neat to me because I used to be quite the explorer myself, and I've seen some pretty weird stuff too. In fact, in some of my old abandoned buildings video, some of the stories are things that happened to me. When I was younger, me and my siblings used to go out exploring all the time. Although I really didn't have quite the experiences that some people have. Well, thanks for being patient and waiting for this video. Hope everything is going well. And most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.